All right, what is going on, ladies and gentlemen? I am here and I have undertaken a little bit of a project because I was wondering what is the most and least expensive faction to play in Warhammer 40,000. So, what I have done is I've gone through every faction, the complete range of every faction, and I've compared the point values from the newest data slate that came out a couple weeks ago at the time of recording this to the price of the kits. So we're going to be dividing the points by the price to get the points per dollar that any kit will give you. We're going to establish some rules for this. So models will be compared based on their kits. So you see the two images that I have on the screen right now. One is the Carnifexes. They come in a kit of 2. So we'll use the points for 2 Carnifexes and we'll divide it by the cost of the kit. So obviously these kits that come with multiple things are going to have a big advantage. You see the Exalted Sorcerers and the Carnifexes there, and there's more examples of that. One rule that I didn't write here is that I'm going to be trying to keep it to the point maximizing build for the kit. That's going to come up pretty early on and make a pretty big difference, but I will talk about that when we get there, because there's some options, where you can build one generic guy as a character or something like that, and it drastically increases the value you get out of the kits. So some other rules: we're not going to be doing combat patrols. That will be a completely separate video. And I kept all factions separate except for Space Marines. Looking at it now, I probably could have separated some of the Space Marine factions. The only Space Marine faction that I separated was Space Wolves, because they are so different, and their highs and lows are also very different. But Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Black Templars, they're all grouped into one. It comes up, it's a little bit messy with them, but we will talk about that when we get there. They're the last faction that I did, because they were the longest by far, because they have like 100-something different units. I made an Excel sheet with all of this data in it, and as soon as YouTube finishes verifying this account, I will have a link to make yourself a copy of that if you want to look through this, see if I made any errors, because I'm sure that I made some, and give me some feedback. So let's discuss some kind of patterns, right? I was looking to see if maybe there was patterns for the way that Games Workshop was pricing their kits. It really doesn't appear that there are any. I would say, like, as a general rule, anything resin, not even, because we're going to talk about that later, there really is just no patterns. Like, sometimes Forge World models are really bad, sometimes they're not so bad. Named characters are the only thing that I would say tend to have really good value, just because they tend to cost a lot of points, and they are sold as single entities. But before we get too far into this video, go down below and smash that like and subscribe button if you guys enjoy. And also let me know what army you play, and do you think your army is going to be a good value? I have a feeling that some people already know what the good and bad values are going to be. So, but without further ado, let's get into the video. So let's get right into it, and let's start with the Sisters of Battle. The average value for Sisters of Battle is 1.73 points per dollar. So the average army for a Sisters of Battle is going to cost you $1,156.07. Their worst units are the Dialogus, the Mortifiers, and the Celestine Sacrosaints. Sisters are a bit of a weird faction because their named characters, not their named characters, their generic characters are so cheap that they are much worse than other factions. But also, they're just a cheap faction, right? So all of their stuff is a little bit on the cheaper side, which just causes them, as you see, to have a lower points per dollar value than a lot of other armies. If we get into their best units, their Repentia squad is the best at 2.83 points per dollar. These guys are sold in a box of 10, and they just got a point reduction. So they actually just became a worse value, but they are still the best value the Sisters have. And then Paragon Warsuits come in at the number 2 slot, followed by Morven Vol. Those two are pretty close, and after that, it's mostly your named characters and your war machines that are pretty high up on the list, while your generic characters and your infantry stay pretty low on the list. And we can move on to the Custodes. So technically, the average for the Custodes is 2.12 points per dollar, which means your average army is going to be 943.40, right? But that has some caveats to it. So that includes the Forge World Custodes, which are ridiculously expensive, and it includes the Sisters of Silence. which just aren't a very good value. They're very cheap. The worst value in the Custodes Codex is the Prosecutor Squad at 0.83 points per dollar. They are $50 and they are 50 points and they cost $60. So they're really expensive. And then after that, you have the Corona's Grav Carrier and the Pallidus Grav Attack at 0.85. Those are big Forge World resin models. Of course, they're going to be more expensive, right? Just like with most factions. But then where it really shines is the plastic Custodes from Games Workshop. And this is because you can build somebody in these kits as a hero and still have the rest of the squad to go with it. So we see the Custodian Wardens, if you build one of them as a shield captain, are 5.44 points per dollar. That's insane. That's a great value. Same with the Virtus Praetors and the Alaris Custodes. If you build one of them as the character, they become just a so much better value than other kits because you're essentially getting 2 units priced at 1 unit. And it's just great. Just Games Workshop plastic Custodes, excluding the Sisters and excluding Forge World, is the cheapest army you can build in the game by a mile. Like, it's cheaper than anything. So to be fair, I included their whole roster, but if you're just playing pure Custodes, which I feel like is what most people are going to playing this codex, then you have the cheapest army in the game by far. All right, next we move on to AdMech. Ooh, AdMech. The average is 1.43 points per dollar for AdMech, meaning your average army is going to be $1,398.60. So your worst units are the Sidonian Dragoons with Radium Jezzails. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. Cerberus, hopefully that's correct. Sulfur Hounds and the Cerberus Raiders. So Games Workshop really doesn't like your cavalry. They're either really expensive or really cheap points-wise, and either way, it is not a good value. Their best units are the Castellan robots with the Datasmith. Factions that have units where you get a unit plus a character tend to do really well, or that tends to be really good for them. But then your Cataphron Breachers are 2.56 points per dollar, and Belisarius Call is 2.16 points per dollar. So there are some pretty good options if you're looking to just build as cheap as possible for AdMech. This is a bit of a side note, but it is in the data slate, of course. I want to talk about the Titans. They're all bad. I mean, to nobody's surprise, they're all bad. Warhound, 1.32 points per dollar. Warlord, 1.36 points per dollar. And Reaver, 1.74. Those are all really bad. I don't think anybody is buying Titans if they actually want to play the game. So, if you're considering buying a Titan, they're a bad value, but I feel like everybody already knows that anyway. This is just a little side note that I thought was pretty interesting. Moving on to the next actual faction, Aeldari. Their average is 2.11 points per dollar, so their average army is going to set you back $947.87. Their 3 worst units are Rangers at 0.88, Warlock Covenant at 0.92, Warlock Conclave, not Covenant, at 0.92, and Warlock Skyrunner at 1.07. Rangers, pretty self-explanatory. They're just kind of a cheap unit. They're expensive for how much they cost in game. They're just a bad value. But the Warlocks, if you run these guys independently, they are a much better value, but you have the option to run them as a unit of 2, and that is just the much worse way to run them if you want to get your money's worth out of this box set. You should run these guys individually if you want your money's worth. Warlock Skyrunner, there's no real excuse. He's just a bad value. Don't pick him up if you're looking to get the absolute most out of your money when it comes to gaming power. Their best units are the Yinkarn at 4.31 points per dollar, so we're getting really high up there, not quite the 5 of the Custodes. Then what I found really funny is that the weapon platform is a really good value because it's only $30. So the D cannon platform I think costs 125 points in game and is only $30. So you can get 4.17 points per dollar if you build that D cannon platform, which is just not something you would really expect. and it's probably not something that you see super often. I don't really play against Eldari. I don't really know anybody that plays them, but I would assume like these kind of kits where it's just like an artillery thing, unless it's guard, don't really see a lot of play, I don't think. So, but that's pretty cool to think. Like, it's actually a really good value. And then your troop are also very good value. Makes sense. They're a super elite unit, very killy, and they're going to give you an average of 3.56 points per dollar. Next, we're actually moving on to the Imperial Guard. Their average is 1.79 points per dollar. An average army is going to be $1,117.32. Their worst unit is the worst unit we have seen by far, the Avenger Strike Fighter. I'm pretty sure this is a resin model. It's a Forge World resin model, and it comes in at 0.66 points per dollar. Horrible value. Not something most people are running. Funny enough, we're going to see later on as this video continues that flyers tend to be really good value. So this is quite interesting that this one is such a bad value. But then after that, we have the Commissar, which is super common in guard armies. And this guy is just a bad value because of how cheap he is in game. I think he only costs like 30 points in game. He's one of the cheapest single entity characters you could take by far. But just because he's so cheap, even though his model isn't that expensive, he's just a bad value. And then the Cyclops Demolition Vehicle, it's just a bad value. There's nothing else to say about it there. But their best units are your Leman Russes and your super big tanks. So if you run your Leman Russ, or if you build your Leman Russ as a commander, that is the best way to build them. After that, it comes into a Demolisher is the best way to build it. And then your big tank, the Storm Sword, is your best one. So commander is going to be 3.36 points per dollar. Demolisher is going to be 2.71, and Storm Sword is 2.68. Next, we can move on to our Chaos Demons. Their average is 1.95, which gives you an army average of $1,025.64. Their worst units are Nurglings at 0.95. Again, this is just a case of like the unit isn't expensive to buy. It's just a garbage unit. Like it's just meant to sit there and die. Like it doesn't really do a lot other than maybe hold an objective. And then your Changecaster and your Exalted Flamers are also very bad value. But if we move on to the best units in the army, funny enough, two of them are actually Tzeentch again. So that's a very Tzeentchy that two of them are the worst and two of them are the best. The Rendmaster on Blood Throne is the best. This guy's kit is just like really cheap. I think his kit's only like $45, and he gets 3.67 points per dollar that you spend. But then you got Pink Horrors at 3.11 and Blue Horrors at 2.78. With Demons of Chaos, their infantry is really good. I think immediately after Blue Horrors is Bloodletters, and then it's Plague Bearers, and then something else, and then Demonettes. So the infantry is actually really good for Demons of Chaos. Surprisingly, your big demons and your named characters aren't as high up as I thought they would be. I just assumed they would be super great value because they cost a lot of points in game, but they really aren't that good of value if you're trying to just get an army on the field as cheap as possible. All right, now we're moving on to Chaos Knights. The average for Chaos Knights is 2.16, so the average army is $925.93. Your worst units are the Chaos Acastus Knight Porphyrion, again, hope I said that right, at 1.02. So they don't have anything under 1, which is nice. The first faction that doesn't have anything under 1 for their worst units. Chaos Serratus Knight Atropos is your second worst, and the Knight Asterius is your third worst. So nothing really special here. Knights have a very limited range, so it is what it is for these guys that are the worst. They're not too far down from the regular Knights. The regular Knights are at like 2-ish, so they're not too much far below, but these are your worst options if you're strictly trying to go efficiency with your money. And that Chaos Knight Porphyrion is like $700. He is a really expensive model, so I don't think many people are buying him anyway. And then if we want to go to their best units, it is just all the War Dogs. The War Dog Brigand is your best at 3.49, and the Huntsman, Carnivore, and Stalker are all the same at 2.96. War Dogs are just so much better value. Their kit is just so cheap. It's only $94.50, which I guess really isn't cheap, but comparatively to the rest of their army, it's so cheap and it's such a good value. Then if we move on, Chaos Space Marines, the average is 2.06 points per model. The average army is going to run you $970.87. The worst unit is Chaos Cultists. Again, this is just a really like, it's a filler unit. It's like your Gretchen. It's just your basic infantry. They're just there to hold objectives and be like meat shields and move blockers. That's all they're there for, right? But then Chaos Spawn are really bad. Again, because they're super cheap in game, and your Rhino is really bad for the same reason. I also want to say this. It might have been a good idea for me to combine Chaos Space Marines as well, because their generic stuff is all like, this is the worst for pretty much every Chaos Space Marine Legion. So when we move on to future Chaos Space Marine factions, I'm going to exclude these units and focus on the faction specific units. But no, these three units here are just bad value across the board for no matter what Chaos Space Marine faction you're running. These guys are just bad values. Don't get these if you're looking for efficiency. Next, we can move on to their best units, and Abaddon is the best unit on the roster. He comes in at 4 points per dollar exactly. After that, we have the Obliterators and Venom Crawler kit, which comes in at 3.54. And then after that, we have Chaos Terminators at 2.88. So Abaddon, super powerful named character, really cool model too, and great value. In the Obliterator and Venom Crawler, just because it's got 2 units in it, but it's kind of like priced like it only has 1 unit in it. Yeah, that kit only costs $79, so that's a really good value. And they're also really freaking cool models. So if you like those in your army, those are an amazing choice. And then Terminators, you know, kind of small guys, but really big, just value for the points, both in terms of what they can do in game and for the money, because they're just really powerful and they're an awesome, cool choice to bring to your army. Now we can move on to the next Chaos Space Marine Legion, which is the Deathguard. So their average is slightly lower than your regular Chaos Space Marines at 1.93. So your average army is going to set you back $1,026.27. Their worst units, like I said, are technically the same as regular Chaos Space Marines, but the worst Deathguard specific models are the Tallyman, the Deathguard Icon Bearer, and the Poxwalkers. So we see even these guys being the worst specific Deathguard models are better than the worst generic Chaos Space Marine models. So the generic units do tends to be a little bit better, but that doesn't mean, you know, your Poxwalkers, they're still kind of a trash infantry unit. You can buff them a lot if I'm not mistaken, but they are still kind of just meant to be cheap and expendable. And this Icon Bearer and Tallyman, I'm not sure why they're so cheap in game, but they are, and it just leads to them having really bad value. Their best unit is the Lord of Contagion plus Terminators. Now, I think that this is technically a named Lord of Contagion, but they don't sell an independent Lord of Contagion kit, and he doesn't have a point value. Like, the named character doesn't have a point value anymore, so him plus those Blight Lord Terminators are the best value the Deathguard have, and it's by far, right? So it's 5.22 points per model. After that, it is going to be Blight Haulers at 2.83 points per kit. I said model before, but I meant kit. And then after that, it is going to be your Land Raider, which is just a super good value because it's just such a cheap kit and it's such a good kit. And then we can move on to the Dark Eldar. Their average is 1.79 points per dollar. So their average army is going to be 11, 17, 32. I think that number shows up quite a few times. That seems to be a pretty common average. Your worst unit is your Chronos at 0.8. The second worst is Mandrakes at 0.875. If I'm not mistaken, I think these guys are only sold in a Kill Team box set, and the Kill Team box sets tend to be priced a little bit higher than a generic infantry unit would be priced, so it does pull them down, especially for these cheap units. I didn't mention it earlier, but I know the Guard Ratlings, their Kill Team got released to pre-order, and they would be pretty bad just because they're so cheap. Yeah, they would be pretty bad because they're just so cheap in game. Spending $65 for it might be cool if it's a kill team. You can run it as an independent kill team. But then when you transition it into 40k, it's just not a good value. And then your Raider, funny enough, is a pretty bad value. And this is kind of like, when I think Dark Eldar, I think the boats. It's just pretty ironic. He's kind of like their staple unit. But then we can move on to their best units. Scourges are their best units at 3.51 points per dollar you spend. And then the Dark Eldar Flyers are really good value. The Razor Wing Jet Fighter is 2.62 points per dollar, and the Void Raven Bomber is 2.55 points per dollar. So if you want to run Flyers for Eldar, or Dark Eldar, they're actually a really good value. Then we can move on to the Genestealers. Pretty low average at 1.73. So their average army is going to set you back $1,156.07. The Neophyte Hybrids are your worst unit at 1.12 points per dollar, followed by Jackal Alphas and Atlan Jackals at 1.22 and 1.28. So your bikes are really not very good for Genestealers. And overall, not much is super good for you. Most of your stuff hovers between that like 1.5 to 2.5 category, so really average, nothing spectacular at all. Even if we move on to the best units, we can see that the Aberrants are your best unit at 3 points per dollar. And after the Aberrants, the Brood Coven is your best, and that's going to come with 3 single entity units. It comes with a Patriarch, a Primus, and a Magus. So that is just super good value. 3 characters, can't go wrong with it. Awesome. And then your Abominant is your third best option at 2.71. So if you want to run the kind of mutant guys for the Genestealers, they're a pretty good value. And your Patriarch, which is another cool model, is also super good value in his kit. Then we can move on to the Grey Knights. Grey Knights are surprisingly cheap. I expected them to be a good value, but I don't know that I expected them to be as good of a value as they are. So if we look at their average is 2.65, higher than anything we've ever seen, or we've seen so far. Ever seen is a little crazy, but their average army is $754.72, and that's really good compared to everything we've seen so far. The worst unit is going to be the Thunderhawk gunship. That thing is like $915. It is ungodly expensive. And then after that, we have the Rhino and the Razorback. They're built out of the same kit, and they are 1.25 and 1.42 respectively. And you notice that like none of the Grey Knights notably bad units are Grey Knight specific units. It's the generic stuff that just happens to be really bad. But if we do move on to their specific units, the Land Raider Banisher is bad at 1.75. No, it's not even bad. That's actually a pretty good number. That's higher than the average for several factions that we've already covered. But then Castellan Crow is at 2. And the fact that him being at 2 is your second worst Grey Knight specific unit just shows you how good Grey Knights are when it comes to value. And then we can move on to your best units. The Stormhawk Interceptor is a really good value for the Grey Knights at 4.3. And then after that, Grey Knights Infantry is an insane value. All of their infantry is like above 3.5. Their Interceptors and their Purifiers specifically are at 3.85. These guys are just a great value. And if you want to build an army of infantry for your Grey Knights, they're killer value. And then Kaldor Drago, he is a bit of an older kit, so it makes sense. He's really good. He's getting an older kit. You know, it just is what it is. He's super cheap, and it's awesome that he is such a good value because he's a cool character in the lore, especially. All right, then we move on to Imperial Agents. They are an army. They're technically an army. I don't know that many people are running these guys as an army. They more ally these units into their other Imperium army, but they still have points, and we are, as such, going to analyze them. Their average is 1.79. A lot of armies is 1.79, and their average army is going to cost 11, 17, 32, like we've seen before. Their worst units are the Inquisitorial Agents kit, which is only going to give you 0.86 points per model. The Inquisitorial Chimera, which gives you 1.08 per model. And the Ministorum Priest, which gives you 1.14 points per model. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this stuff. This isn't really the exciting stuff. These guys are just expensive for the points that they give you. But if we look at their best units, the Calidus, this is where it gets pretty cool. The Calidus Assassin is a really good option at 2.86 points per dollar. After that, the Deathwatch Watchmaster is a super good value at 2.84 points per dollar. And the Eversor Assassin, Eversor, I can't remember how to pronounce that one, is a good value at 2.75 points per model. So your lows are pretty low for Imperial Agents, but these guys are guys, you know, that you can just add into your Imperium army. And the Assassins tends to be very good or higher than average. So they're a nice little addition that you can have if maybe your army is lacking the nice, valuable units that are good for your money. Then we can move on to the Knights. Slightly lower than Chaos Knights, which I was surprised about. Imperial Knights average is 2.13. The average cost is $938.97. Your worst units, I think, are exactly the same as Chaos Knights. I think with one exception. I think the Atropos wasn't with Chaos Knights. Let me go check really quick. No, like yours are legitimately exactly the same as the Chaos Knight worst ones. Yeah, so for some reason I had to go back and actually look because I thought I made a mistake. No, the Imperial Knight Atropos is 5 points more expensive than the Chaos Knight one. I'm not sure why, but it makes it an even worse value, and it brings your average down below theirs even more than it already would be. Their best units are the Warglaves, but their Warglaves are not quite as good a value as Chaos Knight's War Dogs. So, did I say Warglaves? I meant Armingers, but your Arminger Warglaive is your best at 2.96, followed by your Helverin at 2.75, and then your Knight Valiants at 2.68. So your tiny stompy robots are actually a better value for your Knight army than your big stompy robots, even though the big stompy robots are, of course, more fun. If we move on to the Leagues of Votann, pretty much, you know, the 6 units that we're going to show is like their entire range. I think they only have like 10 units in their range. But their average is 1.62. So an average army is going to be $1,234.57. Their worst units are their Broke Here Iron Masters at 1.12. Their Broke Here Thunderkin at 1.33. And their Hernkin Jaegers, my bad, at 1.38. So again, their lows aren't terribly low. It's just they don't have any particularly valuable units. And since they're like a pretty new army with plastic kits, they're just bound to be more expensive and a worse value than the armies that have older stuff to lay back on. But then if we look at their best units, again, it's not even that much higher. Their Einherjar Hearthguard are their best unit at 2.4 points per model, and that's not even that good. You know, that's lower than the Grey Knight's average, and it's their best model. After that, the Hecaton Land Fortress and Uther the Destined are tied at 1.9. So Leagues of Votann are just not an army that you should get into if you're looking to play Warhammer cheaply, which I don't think you really can play Warhammer cheaply if you're buying new kits. And if we then move on to Necrons, their average is 2.16, and their average army is 925 to 93. Their worst units are also, none of them are under 1. So the flayed ones are their worst at 1.03, followed by Tomb Blades at 1.25, and then I have no idea how to pronounce that. Ophidian Destroyers at 1.28. Not terrible, just not great. And their good units are really good. So if we move on to those, their best unit is the C'tan, right? So C'tan, Shard of the Nightbringer, is a whopping 5.86 points per model. 87, my bad, points per model. And then the Shard of the Deceiver is 5.10 points per model. Just great value. And I think that has to do with these kits just being a little bit older. They're still resin cast, but they're so expensive in game. Real life, I mean, money wise, they're like $52. And they give you like 300 points for the Shard of Nightbringer. So that's just a great way to add just so many points to your army. And then the Obelisk plus the C'tan kit is 3.22, which is your third best and is another just amazing value. And it comes with 2 models instead of 1, which is always cool. Then we can move on to the Orks. And I'm not going to lie, I actually thought Orks were going to be worse than they are. This is my army, and I remember Orks being quite a bit more expensive than this, but their average is actually 1.78. So 1123.60 is their average army cost. Their worst unit is mech guns, which I had figured, they're only 50 points and they're $60 per mech gun. Very expensive and inefficient. Then it's your Gargantuan Squiggoth. So it's actually more cost efficient to buy a Gargantuan Squiggoth than it is to buy mech guns, which is pretty funny to me. And then after that, it's the Hunter Rig, which is just like weirdly expensive to buy money-wise and weirdly cheap in-game. It feels like it needs a little bit of rebalancing to make it a little bit better. But then if we move on to the best Orc units, the best unit in the Orc roster is the Stompa at 5.52. Then it is Ghazghkull Thraka at 2.97. Then it is Mozrog Scragbad at 2.75. And here is something very funny with the Orcs. If you run 2 Stompas plus Mozrog plus Ghazghkull, that is an even 2,000 points. And I think that's the cheapest army that you can put together for the Orcs. It may not be a very good army. It probably wouldn't win you games on objectives because you have like no control, but it is a super funny army. And the Stompa was actually the motivation for me to make this video because I saw how good of value he was. And I was like, whoa, I wonder what other good values there are out there for Warhammer and what models we should be focusing on if maybe we don't want to break the bank. So if you play Orcs, just, buy yourself a Stompa. They're the best value by far. They're a great value and a great excuse to buy a Stompa. Space Wolves, the only Space Marine Legion that I kept separate. Their average is 2.02, meaning their average army is $985.22. And their wolves are really bad value. The Fenrisian wolves are 0.71, one of the lowest in the game. The Cyberwolf comes in a kit of 1. It comes with 1 single Cyberwolf and is 0.83. And then Canis Wolfborn, funny enough, is their 3rd lowest value at 1.25. It's not super common for us to see these named characters be a bad value, but he is. And their best units, we see another flyer. We see Stormfang Gunship is their best at 3.26. Then we see 2 named characters, Bjorn the Fell-Handed at 3.04 and Arjak Rockfist at 2.9. And then I think Lorgar comes right after, followed, he's followed closely by the other named characters the Space Wolves have. And their Terminators and whatnot. All the Space Wolves are a pretty good value overall. Just stay away from the super low value stuff. Their good stuff is pretty good. Then we can move on to an army I was surprised was so low. And that's the Tau. The Tau have an average of 1.49 points per model. Absolutely horrendous. So the average army is going to set you back $1,342.28, with their worst unit being the Krutox Rider at 0.89, the second worst being the Kroot Hounds at 0.95, followed by the Tiger Shark at 1. I went ahead and also included the Kroot Carnivores here, just to show that like the Kroot are really where the bad value comes in for the Tau. But if we skip ahead here to their best units, it's really not much better. The Storm Surge is at 2.06. That's their highest unit, is barely above 2, and it's one of the biggest models in their roster. After that, the Razor Shark Strike Fighter is at 2.02. Again, just like really bad value. And then the Vespid Stingwings and Hammerhead Gunship are tied in third place at 2 points per dollar. So Tau are just really bad. Their whole army stays like right in that 1.5 to 2 range, meaning that no matter what you buy, you're getting an equally bad point per dollar value, which really sucks. These models are really cool. They're just not very good value for the game. And if we move on to the Thousand Sons, their average is 2.19, with their average army being 91324. Now, these guys are actually an exception, where their faction-specific units are a little bit worse than the generic bad Chaos Space Marine ones. So the Zangors are a bad value here. Zangor Enlightened cost way too much for their points. They give you a value of 0.83 points per dollar. And then your cultists are bad, and then your regular Zangors are 1.12. I think after that, then it's your Rhino, and then it is your Zangor Shaman. So Zangors are just really bad, and you should avoid them if you want to cheaply build a Thousand Sons army. And then we can move on to their best units. The Sorcerer Kit is their best unit, because you get 3 Sorcerers in this kit, one of them on a disc. It is just a killer value. I don't think there's any other like just individual kit like this. Well, no, because the Brood Coven kit for Genestealers does the same thing. It gives you 3 different heroes, which is just an awesome value. And then after that, we got Ahriman at 3.33, and then Rubric Marines at 3.2. So it's pretty cool that the Rubric Marines are a nice value. They're kind of a staple to the Thousand Sons and probably one of their more iconic units. And then we can move on to the Tyranids, another faction that I thought was going to be worse than it is, but it's not horrible. Their average is 1.82 points per dollar. The average army is $1,098.90, with the worst units being the Pyrovores at 0.77, the Venomthropes being the second worst at 0.89, and the Biovore being the third worst at 0.96. I don't really have a lot to say here. I'm not a lot to commentate. These are just the bad units. The Pyrovore is like very low. Like that's a very bad value for like if you compare it average to all the kits in the game. If you're gonna get that kit, I guess build it as the Biovore. I think they're the same kit because it's just a better value. Then we can move on to their best units. The Mighty Swarm Lord, absolutely terrifying model, is the best at 3.84 points per dollar, followed by the Sporocyst at kit. That thing comes with like technically like 3 separate units because the Spore Mines can be split into units as well, and they're 3.61 units, or my fault, 3.61 points per dollar. And then the Hive Tyrant comes in at 3.6. So your big entity units are pretty good for the Tyranids, and the other units that we just mentioned are not so good. Your Horde infantry is also kind of middle of the pack, but leaning to lower. So stick to your single entities if you want the best value for your Tyranid lists. Then we can move on to the World Eaters with an average of 2.04 points per dollar. The average army is going to set you back $980.39. Your worst units, not including the regular specific ones, are the Jackals at 1.12, the World Eater's Lord on Juggernaut at 1.23, and the Khorne Berserkers at 1.39. So yeah, your regular, like, actual Khorne specific models are not that good. They're not anything to write home about. But if we do go to your best, I did find this interesting. The World Eater's Master of Executions is slightly higher points than the regular Chaos Master of Executions. In a regular Chaos Space Marine army, he's not that good of value, but in this army, he's a great value. Then your next two are generic, so it's the Land Raider and the Terminators. You can see those there, but I wanted to talk about the Khorne specific ones. The Exalted 8-bound at 2.56 points per model are pretty good, and Angron is pretty good at 2.48. And I know Angron is a super competitive choice, so that's good. You know, if you buy his kit, you are getting good point value out of that kit, that pretty expensive Primarch kit. And the Land Raiders and Terminators, you can't go wrong with them. They're a great value, big tanky things that Games Workshop seems to really like. So let's move on to the final army. I think the Space Marines. Yes, Space Marines. Their average is 2.03. Their average army is $985.22. Now, this is where I technically made a little bit of a mistake. The worst units that you see here, Thunderhawk Gunship, Impulsor, and Invader ATV, are the generic worst units. Thunderhawk Gunship we already saw is bad. Impulsor I was pretty surprised about. But the Invader ATV is actually like the 5th lowest. The Raven Wing Black Knights for the Dark Angels, and the Black Templar Impulsor, which is slightly more points than the regular Impulsor, don't know why, somebody's gonna have to explain that to me, are technically worse values than the Invader ATV, but since they are faction specific, I didn't want to put them here. Just know those units are slightly worse. And then we can move on. The two best units, the three best, are named characters. So Gilliman and Lionel Johnson, the Primarchs, are the best, followed by Calgar. Gilliman coming in at 4.92, and Johnson coming in at 4.5, with Calgar trailing all the way down at 3.36. You know, these guys are super powerful in game. I think Calgar got a point increase in the latest data slate, so it's not super surprising. And the Primarchs are Primarchs. They're going to be super powerful and expensive in game. But then if we move on to the generic units, the Desolation Squad is your best at 3.33 points per dollar. And then your Infiltrator Squad is going to be your second best at 3.2 points per dollar. And the Assault Terminators are your third best generic option at 2.88 points per dollar. Now, I want to say that this is not like the actual top three. It doesn't go, you know, Gilliman, Johnson, Calgar, and then these three. These three are actually quite a bit down, except the Desolation Squad. It's right there. But the named characters for Space Marines for all of the chapters tend to be very good value. I think Dante is up there. Vulcan is up there. What's another one that's up there? So there's others up there that are just really good values. So the named characters for Space Marines do tend to be very good value. And then we can move on to our little summary here. So the average points per dollar of a Warhammer box is 1.92. And the average cost of an army is $1,041.64. That is a lot of money to spend on plastic. We can look at the worst armies. They are AdMech, Tau, and Leagues of Votann. And the best armies are Grey Knights, Thousand Suns, and Chaos Knights. Chaos Knights and Necrons are technically tied, but because I rounded down for Chaos Knights. They're like 2.162 something, and Necrons are 2.157 something. So Chaos Knights are just a little bit better than Necrons. And then we can go look at the best and worst units overall. The best unit overall, just 100% best in the game, is the Shard of Nightbringer At 5.87, that is an amazing value. I assume that eventually these models that are resin will get plastic kits and be re-updated. I don't think Necrons have gotten any new models in like 2 years though, so I'm very sorry for you guys. Hopefully that comes at some point for these other Catan. And then the Stampa is the second best. Again, he's just so overpriced. He could probably get cut by 200 points and still wouldn't be a competitive pick. But at 5.25, he is a great value. 800 points for $145 is awesome. And then the Wardens, again, if you build them with the Shield Captain and then 4 regular Wardens, 340 points for $62.5 is amazing. And then we can see, I didn't mention the price, but yeah, 305 points for $52 for that Shard of the Nightbringer is incredible. But we can move on to the worst units. The Avenger Strike Fighter is the worst unit in the game. 130 points for $195. Then the Fenrisian Wolves come in at number 2 worst spot at 30 points for $42. And then finally, the Pyrovores for the Tyranids are 0.77, 40 points for $52. So what have we learned? It's that Games Workshop stuff is super expensive, but if you play in your armies and if you're not going for a theme, you just want to play an army, then there is some better and some worse stuff. Just be careful, shop secondhand, try to save yourself as much money as possible. And if you guys want to see more content like this, make sure you let me know that you like this by leaving a like and subscribing. It means a ton and it helps the channel grow. I think I'm going to do the combat patrols next and examine which one of those is the best value. So stay tuned for that one, and you guys have a wonderful night. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Peace.